My name is Ishikawa Tatsuo, and for 31 years I carried cargo across the inland sea of Japan. I am writing this down because my hands still shake when I sleep, and because the men who sailed with me are mostly gone now, and the truth deserves to outlive us. What I am about to tell you happened in the autumn of 1912, on a moonless night between the islands, when the water went silent and something passed beneath my ship that had no end to it. We were running coal and rice from Kobe to Matsuyama aboard the Hoyo Maru, a steel-hulled cargo steamer of roughly 400 tons. The night I remember most began ordinary. We left port at sundown, the lanterns lit, the boiler humming, the sea black as wet ink. By the third hour, the wind died, not weakened, died. The sails of the fishing boats we passed hung like wet rags, and the smoke from our stack rose straight up as if drawn on paper. I had sailed those waters since I was 16, and I had never felt air so still. First Mate Sato came up beside me at the wheelhouse window. He was a thin man, careful with words, the sort who measured his speech the way other men measured grain. He said only, "Captain, the water." I looked down. The sea around the hull had gone flat, not calm, flat, as if a sheet of black glass had been laid across it from horizon to horizon. There were no ripples from our own bow. The wake we should have been cutting was simply absorbed. Then the ship lifted, not pitched, lifted. A long, slow rise of perhaps half a meter, as if a great hand had pushed up from below. It held us there for a breath, then set us down again, gentle as a mother. Sato did not move, neither did I. Beneath the hull, something was sliding. I could feel it through the deck plates, through the soles of my boots, a long continuous pressure passing from bow to stern. I counted in my head. 10 seconds, 20, a minute, 2 minutes. The pressure did not stop. Whatever was beneath us was longer than the ship, and it was still coming. We stood like that for nearly half an hour. No one spoke. The engineer's bell did not ring. The lookout did not call. The thing simply moved beneath us, and we let it, because there was nothing else we could do. By the time the pressure eased and the water remembered how to ripple again, my shirt was soaked through, though the night was cool. At dawn, when the gray light finally crept across the deck, we found it coated in a thin, dark film. It smelled like nothing I had ever known. Not oil, not blood, not fish. Something older. Something that had no business on the deck of a working ship. That was the beginning. I did not know it then. I thought it was the end of something. A single strange night in a long career. But the sea is patient, and so are the things that live in it, and they were not finished with me. To understand what came after, you must understand the Sito Neikai, the inland sea, as it was in those years. It is not one sea, but many. A long stretch of protected water lying between the great island of Honshu to the north and Shikoku to the south, broken by hundreds of smaller islands, some no larger than a temple roof, some big enough to hold villages and shrines. The channels between them are narrow in places, deep in others, and the currents change with the tide in ways that have killed careless men since before our grandfathers were born. In 1912, the sea was crowded. Steam was replacing sail, but the old wooden boats still outnumbered us. Fishing shifts, salt barges, lumber rafts, passenger ferries, naval tenders, all of them moving day and night through the same lanes. We knew each other's whistles. We knew each other's lanterns. A man could pass 100 vessels on a single run and recognize half of them by the cut of their bow. But there were places we did not go after dark. Every captain on that sea kept a private list, scratched in the margin of a chart or held only in memory. A channel between two islands where compasses behaved strangely. A bay where the fog came in too quickly. A stretch of open water where the fish refused to school no matter the season. The old men called these places Kuroi Michi, the Black Roads, and they steered around them the way a farmer steers around a grave. My crew was small. Sato as first mate, Kenji Mori as engineer, a square-built man from Osaka who believed only in things he could measure with a wrench. 6 deckhands, mostly young, mostly from the fishing villages of the Shikoku coast. And there was Captain Hiroshi Takeda, who was not my crew at all, but a friend. An older master who ran the Saryu Maru on a route that crossed mine twice a week. We would meet in the harbor at Onamichi and drink tea and complain about freight rates. And sometimes, late in the evening, when the other captains had gone to bed, he would tell me things he had seen that he did not tell anyone else. The fishing villages along our route were small and poor and old. Houses of dark wood, leaning toward the water. Shrines on the headlands, ropes of white paper hanging in the wind. The fishermen there did not write much down, but they remembered everything. They remembered which grandfather had drowned and where. They remembered which nets had come up empty for 3 nights running in the summer of some year before the Meiji Emperor was born. They remembered, and they warned their sons, and their sons listened, because the sea does not forgive men who do not listen. It was in one of those villages, a place called Mihara on the Honshu shore, that I first met the old fisherman Nakamura. But that came later. First came the smaller signs, the kind a man can almost convince himself he imagined. The week after the night of the flat water, we made the run again. Different cargo, same route. The sea was ordinary. The wind blew from the southwest. The wake curled white behind us as it should. I told myself I had been tired. I told myself the lift of the hull had been a swell from a distant ship, the oil a leak from our own engine that Mori had not yet found. Mori, when I asked him, looked at me as if I had insulted his mother. "Captain," he said, "my engine does not leak. If it leaked, I would know before you did." He was right. I knew he was right. But I needed a story I could live with, and so I let it sit. 3 nights later, the second sign came. We were anchored off a small island called Ikuchi, waiting for the morning tide to carry us through a narrow passage. The deckhands had cast lines over the side to catch their supper. They caught nothing, not a single bite. This was strange because the waters around Ikuchi were known for sea bream and mackerel. And on any ordinary night, a man could fill a bucket before the first hour was out. The youngest of them, a boy named Taro, pulled up his hook again and again and found only bare metal. After a while he stopped pulling and just stared at the water. "Captain," he said, "the fish are gone." I told him fish move. I told him the tide was wrong. I told him many things, none of which I believed. Because I had noticed something else. The gulls were gone too. There should have been gulls roosting on the rocks of the island, calling now and then through the dark. There were none. The whole stretch of water around us was silent in a way that water is never silent. No splash. No fin breaking the surface. No small life moving in the shallows. Only the faint creak of our own ropes against the cleats. Around midnight, Sato came to me. He had been on deck watch. He did not look afraid, exactly. He looked puzzled, the way a man looks when an instrument he has trusted his whole life gives him a reading that cannot be true. "There is a sound, Captain," he said. "Under the hull, like something brushing against the keel. But the water is still." I went out with him. We stood at the rail and listened. For a long minute there was nothing. Then I heard it, a slow, soft scraping, the way a wet rope drags across wood. It moved from the stern toward the bow, then back again. It was beneath us, somewhere in the dark water under the keel. There was no current to push debris against the hull. There was no other vessel within a mile. There was only the sound and the silence around it, and the feeling that whatever was making it was taking its time. We weighed anchor before dawn. I told the crew it was the tide. They did not argue. They had heard it too. The reports began to reach me through the harbors. A man hears things when he drinks tea in the same tea house for 30 years. A fisherman out of Tamanura had pulled his nets at dawn and found them slick with a dark, greasy film that would not wash off in salt water. A coastal steamer out of Imabari had reported its hull lifted by a swell on a windless night. A passenger ferry running between Hiroshima and Matsuyama had passed through what the captain described, in his private log, as a wake without a ship. A long V of disturbed water trailing across the channel toward an empty horizon. None of these stories made the newspapers. Captains do not tell strange stories to newspapers. We tell them to each other in low voices after the 3rd cup. And what I heard when I began to listen was that there were more of these accounts than I had imagined. Far more. They went back years. They went back, some of them, to before I was born. Captain Takeda was the one who brought me the residue. We met at Onamichi in the second week of October. He came down the gangplank of the Suryu Maru with a glass jar in his hand. Inside the jar was a dark, viscous liquid, almost black, with a faint shimmer when the light caught it. He set it on the table between us and did not say anything for a long while. "Off in Ashima," he said at last. "3 nights ago. The whole foredeck was coated. My boys scraped it into buckets. This is what's left after it sat a day." He turned the jar slowly. The liquid moved more slowly than oil should. It clung to the glass. "It is not whale fat. It is not bilge. I had a man at the refinery look at it. He could not say what it was. He said it was not anything he had a name for. I told him about the flat water. I told him about the silence at Ikuchijima. He listened without interrupting, and when I was done he nodded once, the way a man nods when something he has feared is finally confirmed. "There is a fisherman in Mihara," he said. "Nakamura. He is older than the harbor wall. If you have time before your next run, go and see him. Tell him what you told me. Listen to what he tells you back." I went the next afternoon. Nakamura lived in a small house at the edge of the village where the path turned to mud before it reached the beach. He was thin and small and brown as old leather, with hands that had been broken and reset so many times the fingers no longer lined up properly. He sat on the step of his house and mended a net while I spoke. He did not look up. When I finished, he tied off the knot he was working on, set the net aside, and looked at me for the first time. "You met the Ikuchi," he said. The word meant nothing to me then. I asked him to say it again. He did. Then he told me what it was. "The Ikuchi," he said, "was a creature of the old stories, older than the temples, older than the names of the islands. It was a serpent, but to call it a serpent was to misunderstand. A serpent has a beginning and an end. The Ikuchi, in the stories of his grandfather and his grandfather's grandfather, had no end that any man had ever seen. It moved through the inland sea slowly, sometimes for hours, sometimes through a whole night, and a ship caught above it could only wait until it had passed. It did not attack. It did not need to. It left behind an oil, thick and dark, that coated whatever it touched. Fishermen who tried to scrape it from their boats fell ill. Some lost the use of their hands. Some lost their minds. He said the stories went back to the time of the warring clans. He said there were temple records on a small island whose name he would not give me, where priests had written down the encounters of fishermen 600 years ago. The descriptions, he said, had not changed. Not the length, not the slowness, not the oil, not the silence of the water before it came. I asked him why no one spoke of it now. He smiled, a small dry smile with no humor in it. "Because the men who speak of it," he said, "are not believed. And the men who are believed do not speak of it. That is how a thing lives for 600 years and is still a secret." Before I left, he gave me one piece of advice. "If you feel the water go flat," he said, "do not stop the engine. Do not turn the wheel. Let it pass beneath you. Do not try to outrun it. You cannot. And do not look too long at the water. The Ikuchi does not need to harm you. The looking is enough." I carried his words back to the ship. I wrote them in my private log that night, in a hand that was not as steady as I would have liked. We had 3 more runs through October without incident. The sea behaved. The wind blew. The fish returned to the lines of the men at the rail. I began, slowly, to wonder if Nakamura had been an old man telling old stories, and if Takeda's jar had held some industrial waste from a foreign ship, and if the night of the flat water had been, after all, only a night. A man wants to believe these things, a captain especially. We are paid to be sensible. Then, in early November, the hull came out of the water for its scheduled cleaning at the yard in Cure. I went down to look at it with the foreman, a man named Ogawa, who had been cleaning hulls since he was a boy. He showed me the usual things: barnacles, a bent plate near the stern from a brush with a piling 2 years before. And then, halfway down the port side, he stopped and called me over. There were marks on the steel. Long, parallel scrapes, 4 of them, running diagonally across 3 of the hull plates. They were not deep. They were not the gouges of a reef or the tear of an anchor chain. They were smooth, almost polished, as if something soft and heavy had pressed against the hull and slid along it for a long distance. The spacing between the marks was even, about the width of a man's spread hand. Ogawa stood with his hands on his hips. "Captain," he said, "I have cleaned 1,000 hulls. I have never seen marks like these." I asked him what could make them. He thought for a long time. Then he said, "Nothing in this harbor." I had a sample of the residue scraped from one of the marks. There was very little of it, only a faint dark streak in the recess of the scrape, but the chemist in cure who looked at it told me, after 3 days, that he could not identify the substance. "It contained fats," he said, "and proteins, and trace minerals, and something else he had no name for that, did not match any marine oil he had on record." He gave me back the sample in a small vial. He did not charge me for the work. He said only, "Captain, where did this come from?" And when I told him, he did not ask again. I began to keep a notebook, not the ship's log which belonged to the company. A private book bound in dark cloth that I carried in my coat. In it I wrote down every account I could gather. I went to harbor offices and asked to see old logs. Most of them refused. A few, run by men I had known a long time, let me read what they had. I wrote down dates. I wrote down positions. I wrote down the names of captains when I could find them and the words they had used. A pattern came clear. Not at once, but slowly, the way a coastline comes clear out of fog, the sightings clustered. There was a stretch of water between the islands of Inoshima and Ikuchi, perhaps 15 nautical miles long, where the encounters were thickest. There was another smaller cluster south of Omishima, a third older near the channel that ran past Migigima. The reports went back in the harbor records I could find to 1847. The oldest one I read had been written by a captain whose name was no longer remembered, in handwriting that had faded to the color of weak tea. He described, on a moonless night in the 7th month of that year, a long shape passing beneath his junk for the better part of 2 hours, and a dark oil on his deck at sunrise that his men could not wash off. The descriptions did not vary, not in any way that mattered. The flat water, the silent lift, the endless passage, the oil. Across 65 years, across captains who could not have known each other, across vessels of wood and steel and sail and steam, the story was the same. I made my plans for the November run with the chart spread out and Nakamura's words in my head. The shortest route from Kobe to Matsuyama ran straight through the Inoshima cluster. I could have gone around. I could have added 6 hours and avoided the channel entirely. I did not. I will not pretend it was for the sake of the cargo. The cargo would have kept. I went through because I wanted to know. A man can live with a mystery for a long time, but there comes a night when he must put his hand on it or admit that he is afraid. We entered the channel just after 11. The moon was a thin sliver, low in the west, and the sky was the color of wet slate. Mori was at the engine. Sato was at the wheel. I stood at the rail on the starboard side and watched the water. It happened the way it had happened before, but slower this time, as if the sea were being careful with us. The wind eased, then it died. The small chop on the surface flattened, then smoothed, then went to glass. Sato did not need to be told. He held the wheel steady and kept the engine at the same speed. I had told them all what Nakamura had said. Do not stop. Do not turn. Let it pass. For the first 10 minutes, there was nothing. Only the flat water and the silence and the soft thump of the engine through the deck. Then the hull lifted. Less than before, but unmistakable. A long, slow rise, then a settling. Beneath my feet, through the iron and the wood, I felt the pressure begin. It moved from forward to aft, I counted. At 30 seconds I thought, this is a whale. At a minute I thought, this is a long whale. At 2 minutes I stopped thinking in those terms. The pressure was steady, continuous. There was no break in it, no shifting of weight, no sense of a creature flexing its body the way a great fish does. It was simply a long, slow, unbroken passage of something solid beneath the keel, and it did not stop. At the bow, Taro the deckhand was holding a lantern over the water. He had been told not to. He was 20 years old and he could not help himself. He leaned out, the lantern held at arm's length, and stared down. After a while he straightened up and walked back toward me along the rail. His face in the lantern light was the color of milk. "Captain," he said. "I can see it." I went forward with him. The others gathered behind me against my orders. We held the lanterns out together and lowered them as close to the surface as we dared. The water was so still that the light went down into it like light into a well. Below us, perhaps 2 meters under the surface, there was a darkness. Not a shape, a darkness. It extended forward into the night and aft into the night, and as far as the lantern light reached in either direction, it did not end. The surface of it, what little we could see, was smooth and faintly ridged, like the back of a great eel, and it moved past us at the slow, steady pace of a man walking. Now and then a section of it caught the light differently, and we saw, for an instant, a sheen like wet stone, and then it was dark again. We stood there with our lanterns out for the better part of an hour. The thing kept moving. Maury came up from the engine room because he could not stand to be below any longer. He looked over the rail once and did not look again. He sat down on a coil of rope with his back against the bulkhead and put his hands over his face. Sato held the wheel. The engine thumped. The lantern oil burned down. I will tell you the thing that frightened me most, because it is the thing I cannot explain to anyone who was not there. We could not find the end, not the front end, not the back end. We walked from bow to stern with the lanterns. We leaned out as far as the rails would let us. The body of the creature extended in both directions beyond the reach of our light, and the light was good, and the water was clear, and the night was still. There was no head visible ahead of the ship and no tail visible behind. There was only the body passing. Sato spoke once, quietly, almost to himself. "How long is the ship?" he said. 58 meters, I said. He nodded. He did not speak again for a long time. When he did, he said, "Captain, it has been passing for 40 minutes. I do not know how to write the rest of that hour. There are things a man's mind refuses to hold properly. I remember the cold. I remember the smell which had begun to rise off the water, faint and sweet and wrong, like something fermenting in a sealed jar. I remember Taro starting to cry, very quietly, without seeming to notice he was doing it. I remember Maury on the rope, whispering numbers under his breath, counting seconds the way a drowning man counts strokes. I remember thinking with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that we had been wrong about the sea, all of us, for all our lives. The fog came in around 2 in the morning. I do not know where it came from. There had been no fog warning, no shift in the wind, because there was no wind. It rose off the water as if the sea itself had begun to breathe out. Within minutes we could not see the bow from the wheelhouse. The lanterns became small soft moons hanging in white air. And it was in the fog that the Ikuchi rose. It did not breach. It did not leap. It simply lifted, somewhere off the port bow, a long low arch of dark body breaking the surface and holding there. We saw it first as a deeper darkness inside the fog. Then, as the ship moved slowly past, we saw the shape of it, scaled, wet, as thick around as a rice barrel. The skin was almost black, but where the lantern light fell on it, it shone with that same oily sheen we had been finding on our decks, a slow rainbow trapped in something that should not have held color at all. It arched out of the water for what I judged to be perhaps 30 meters of visible length, and then it slid back under, smooth as a rope through a hand, and the surface closed over it without a splash. A moment later, further along, another section rose, then another. The body was so long that we were watching different parts of its surface and submerge in sequence, as if a great chain were being drawn through the sea. There was no head. I want to be clear about this, because it is the thing that has stayed with me longest. In all the time we watched, we never saw a head. We never saw an eye. We never saw a mouth. We saw only the body surfacing and sinking, and the oil it left behind spreading slowly across the water in long dark slicks. I do not know how long we watched. Sato says 40 minutes. Mori says an hour and a half. I have stopped trying to reconcile them. Time did not behave properly inside that fog. When it ended without ceremony. The surfacing stopped. The pressure beneath the hull eased. The fog began to thin. The wind, after a long absence, returned in a single soft breath from the south. The sea remembered itself. Small waves began again. A gull cried somewhere we could not see. We were alone on the water. The deck, when the gray light came, was coated. Every horizontal surface. The hatches, the rails, the coils of rope, the canvas covers of the lifeboats. The oil was thicker than before, almost a paste in places, and it stank in the rising sun with a smell I will not try to describe except to say that 2 of the deckhands were sick over the side before we could begin the cleaning. The cleaning nearly cost us a man. Taro slipped on the foredeck while scrubbing and went down hard against the rail, and only Sato's hand on his collar kept him from going over. He cracked 2 ribs and split his scalp open and lay in his bunk for the rest of the voyage with his eyes open, staring at the boards above him, not speaking. Mori burned his hands on the residue. He had not worn gloves the first time he touched it, and within an hour the skin on his palms had reddened and blistered, and for weeks afterward he could not grip a wrench without pain. I treated the burns with what we had, and I made a note in my book, and I gave the order to make full steam for Matsuyama. We did not see the creature again on that voyage. We did not see it on the next. We did not see it again at all. Whatever the Ikuchi is, it does not haunt a man twice in the same way. It shows itself once, fully, and then it lets him live with what he saw. In Matsuyama, I made my report to the harbor master as the rules required. I left out the long parts. I said only that we had encountered an unusual marine disturbance and an oily residue, and that 1 crewman was injured in the cleanup. The harbor master, a tired man near retirement, read what I had written and looked at me for a long moment, and then signed it without comment. He had read reports like mine before. I could see it in his face. He filed the paper in a drawer that I do not believe was ever opened again. The company in Kobe was less patient. They asked about the delay, about the cleaning costs, about Taro's medical bills. When I tried, once, in a private meeting with the freight director, to describe what we had seen, he listened for less than a minute and then held up his hand. "Captain Ishikawa," he said, "you are a good master. You have been with us 19 years. I am going to tell you something for your own benefit. There are no sea serpents. There are tired men and bad lights and strange swells, and there are captains who keep their positions and captains who do not. Do you understand me?" I understood him. I did not speak of it again to the company. I went back to my roots. I carried my coal and my rice. I drank my tea with Takeda in Onamichi. He had heard by then what had happened to us. He did not ask me to describe it. He only said once, "How is the young one?" And I said, "He no longer goes on deck at night," and he nodded and looked into his cup. The years went by. I kept my notebook. I added entries to it whenever I heard a new account, and the accounts kept coming. A steamer out of Beppu in 1915. A naval auxiliary in 1919 that lost 3 men overboard in calm water for reasons no one ever wrote down. A fishing fleet out of Mahara in 1923 that came back with every deck slicked dark and every man refusing to sail those waters again. The descriptions did not change. The flat water, the silent lift, the endless passage, the oil. Nakamura died in the winter of 1921. I went to his funeral. There was no one there but his daughter and 2 old men from the village. I left a small offering at his shrine and walked back along the beach in the cold. The sea that day was gray and ordinary, and 1,000 small waves were running up onto the sand. And somewhere far out beyond the islands, the thing he had warned me about was still moving, slow and dark and without end, and the men on the ships above it did not know. I am an old man now. I no longer go to sea. My eyes are not what they were, and my hands shake, and the company retired me with a small pension and a clock that does not keep time. I sit in a house in Onamichi that looks out over the harbor, and in the evenings I watch the lights of the ships moving through the channel, and I think about the things I have written in my book. I have read those entries many times, different captains, different decades, different vessels, the same story, the same flat water, the same oil, the same impossible length passing beneath the keel in the dark. I have come to believe that some legends survive not because men invent them, but because too many witnesses, across too many years, tell the same story without having met. The fishermen of Mahara knew this before any of us. They tried to warn us. We did not listen, because we had iron hulls and steam engines and the confidence of our age, and we believed the sea was a thing we had finally learned. We had not learned it. We had only learned its surface. If you sail those waters, and you should not sail them alone at night, but if you do, and the wind dies, and the chop on the water flattens into glass, and you feel the deck rise once beneath your feet and settle again, do as Nakamura told me. Hold your course. Keep your engine steady. Do not turn. Do not stop. Do not lean too long over the rail with a lantern in your hand. Let it pass. It will pass. It always passes. And in the morning, when you scrape the dark oil from your deck and bury it in the sea, do not speak of what you saw to anyone who was not there with you. They will not believe you. And the ones who do will already know. I never saw where the creature began. I never saw where it ended. I only know that it is still down there, in the long quiet water between the islands, and that on some moonless night, beneath some other ship, it is moving still.